What if the first love story you ever witnessed was a tragedy? Would you ever dare to write your own? Josh never liked weddings. He told himself it was because of the forced smiles, the over-the-top speeches, the illusion that love could be wrapped up in vows and sealed with a kiss. But deep down, he knew the real reason. Weddings reminded him of the beginning of something that, in his world, always had an expiration date: divorce. That word had shaped him more than he ever admitted. It was a shadow that clung to his name, a lesson learned too early. His parents' marriage had collapsed like a house of cards, and Josh had spent his life walking carefully, avoiding any gust of wind that could send his own relationships tumbling. And yet, here he was, sitting in the back row of a sunlit garden, watching two people make promises he didn't believe in. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders, trying to push away the weight pressing on his chest. The couple exchanged rings. The crowd sighed, and somewhere behind him, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. That's when he heard her voice. "Didn't expect to see you here, Josh." His head turned before he could stop himself. Zoe. She looked the same, no, better. The kind of beauty that time only sharpened. Her dark eyes still had that quiet intensity, the one that had always made him feel like she saw straight through him. "I could say the same," he replied, clearing his throat. She smiled, small and knowing. "I think weddings make you uncomfortable," Josh chuckled dryly. "That obvious?" She tilted her head, studying him. "It's written all over your face. Still afraid of love?" The words hit him like a flicker of lightning on dry ground, setting something inside him ablaze. He opened his mouth to respond, but she leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. "Do you ever wonder what could have been?" Her question slipped through the cracks in his armor, unsettling him in a way he didn't expect. And just like that, he felt it, that familiar itch to run before anything could reach too deep. But this time, something told him it was already too late. Josh barely heard the rest of the wedding. The vows, the applause, the clinking of champagne glasses, it all faded into a distant hum. Zoe's words had stirred something old, something buried. Do you ever wonder what could have been? He knew the answer. He had thought about it more times than he cared to admit. Not just with Zoe, but with every woman who had ever gotten too close. But wondering was dangerous. It led to hope, and hope was a slippery thing. Because no matter how many times he had tried to rewrite the past in his head, the ending was always the same: divorce. The first time he had heard that word, he hadn't understood what it truly meant. He was just a kid, sitting in the living room, watching his mother cry, while his father packed a suitcase. "It's for the best," his father had said, as if breaking a family apart could ever be the best option. His mother had never remarried. She had never even dated. She used to say that love was just a beautifully wrapped box with nothing inside. And Josh had believed her. Because when you grow up watching love turn into resentment, into silence, into two people who once shared a home now pretending to be strangers, how do you ever believe in love again? The memory faded as Josh found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror of the wedding hall's restroom. He looked tired, or maybe just lost. His phone buzzed. A text from Zoe. "Meet me outside?" He hesitated. Every instinct told him to ignore it, to keep walking the familiar path of detachment. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. And that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing of all. The night air was crisp as Josh stepped outside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The wedding hall glowed behind him, laughter spilling out from the open doors. Zoe was already there, leaning against the wooden railing, her phone in one hand, a champagne flute in the other. She looked up as he approached, offering a small smile. "Thought you might run." Josh let out a quiet laugh. "Almost did." Zoe tilted her head, studying him. "What stopped you?" He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but it was buried under years of self-preservation. She sighed, swirling the liquid in her glass. "You know, I used to think you were the kind of guy who just didn't want to settle down. But now I wonder if you're just afraid to." Josh tensed, his gaze flickering to the distant horizon. The weight of her words pressed against his ribs, uncomfortable but not entirely wrong. "It's not fear," he finally said. "It's knowing how these things end." Zoe scoffed. "Not everything ends in divorce, Josh." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "You sure about that? Because every example I had growing up says otherwise." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she set down her glass and folded her arms. "So what? You just decide love isn't worth the risk? You cut yourself off from it entirely?" Josh exhaled, shaking his head. "Love is like a game where the house always wins. Some people are willing to gamble. I'm not." Zoe frowned. "But what if you're wrong? What if you've spent your whole life running from something that could have been good?" He didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew that was the real question. The one he never let himself ask. And yet, here he was, standing in the glow of a wedding he didn't want to attend, talking to the one person who made him question everything. The drive home was quiet. Josh kept his hands on the wheel, his mind on everything but the road. Zoe's words echoed in his head, picking at wounds he thought had long since healed. "What if you're wrong? What if?" He clenched his jaw, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. He didn't like the uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. By the time he pulled into his driveway, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. He stepped inside, flicking on the lamp, and was immediately greeted by the silence of an empty house. It was a familiar silence, a chosen one. He kicked off his shoes and made his way to the small bookshelf in his living room. On the top shelf, hidden between novels he never finished, was an old photograph. His parents. Before everything fell apart. He hadn't looked at it in years. Josh ran a thumb over the edges of the frame, staring at the image of a younger version of his mother and father. They looked happy. Or at least, they looked like they had convinced themselves they were. But he remembered the fights behind closed doors. The long nights where his mother sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The way his father eventually stopped coming home at all. They had been in love once, and then they weren't. Josh set the photo down, exhaling slowly. Maybe Zoe was right. Maybe he had spent his whole life avoiding something he didn't even understand. But was understanding enough to change anything? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Josh wasn't the type to revisit old wounds. He had spent years perfecting the art of moving forward without looking back. But that night, sleep never came. At 2 a.m., he found himself sitting on his couch, the old photograph still resting on the table. The past had a way of creeping in when you least expected it. He picked up his phone, his fingers hesitating over a contact he hadn't dialed in years. His mother. It had been a while. Too long, probably. With a deep breath, he pressed call. She answered on the third ring. "Josh?" He cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom." A pause. Then softer, "Is everything okay?" Josh exhaled slowly. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She didn't rush to fill the silence. She had always been good at that, waiting, letting him take his time. Finally he asked, "Do you think it was worth it?" She didn't need clarification. She knew exactly what he was asking. Her voice was quiet. "The divorce?" Josh nodded, even though she couldn't see him. A long sigh crackled through the receiver. "I used to ask myself that a lot. In the beginning, it felt like breaking everything apart was the only way to breathe again. But looking back, I wonder if we broke more than just the marriage." Josh's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I mean you. You and your sister. I see the way you both avoid relationships, the way you don't trust love, and I wonder if staying would have been better for you." Josh swallowed hard. He had never heard her admit that before. "Would it have?" he asked. Her voice was tired. "I don't know, but I do know that love isn't supposed to make you feel trapped." And we were. Josh leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. He wanted to be angry. But instead, he just felt lost. "Do you regret it?" he asked. A long pause. Then a quiet, "Sometimes." Josh closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to think. The next morning, Josh sat at his kitchen table, his untouched coffee growing cold. His mother's words still echoed in his head. "I wonder if we broke more than just the marriage. It wasn't the divorce itself that had shaped him. It was everything that came after. The loneliness, the mistrust, the quiet gnawing belief that love wasn't built to last. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages he had ignored the night before. One from Zoe stood out. "You disappeared. Hope you're okay." Josh hesitated, then typed back, "I'm fine. Just thinking." A reply came almost instantly. "That's new." He smirked despite himself. But the truth was, she wasn't wrong. He had spent most of his life avoiding these thoughts, avoiding anything that might force him to question the walls he had built. And yet, here he was. A new message popped up. Thinking about what? Josh stared at the screen. He could lie, tell her it was nothing, that he was just tired. But for once, he didn't want to. Instead, he typed back, "What if we spend so much time avoiding heartbreak that we miss something good?" There was no immediate response. Then, after a long minute, "I think that's the real question, isn't it?" Josh set his phone down, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it was, but was he ready for the answer? Josh had always thought of life as a series of choices. Some were easy, some were difficult, and some, like his parents' divorce, were made for him long before he had a say in them. But now, as he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the fading light outside, he realized that this was one choice only he could make. His mother's voice lingered in his mind. "I wonder if we broke more than just the marriage." Had they? Or had the break simply revealed what was already fragile? Josh had spent years dissecting his parents' divorce, searching for the moment when love had turned into something unrecognizable. But maybe there was no single moment. Maybe love just unraveled over time, slipping through the cracks until nothing remained. And wasn't that the real problem? He had never trusted love. Not really. Not after watching it fail in the one place it should have lasted. His father had left. His mother had stayed but had never truly been the same. The house, once filled with warmth, had grown silent, empty in ways that couldn't be fixed with new furniture or fresh paint. Josh had learned early on that relationships came with an expiration date, that no matter how much you wanted something to last, love was just another fragile thing. One wrong step, one hard season, and it shattered. He picked up his phone, staring at Zoe's last message. "I think that's the real question, isn't it?" Maybe it was, but he already knew his answer. Josh had spent his life avoiding heartbreak, not because he was afraid of pain, but because he understood it too well. He knew what came after, the slow unraveling, the empty spaces, the quiet grief of losing something that was once whole. He had watched his mother pick up the pieces of her life after divorce. He had watched his father disappear into another existence, another family, another version of himself. And through it all, Josh had promised himself one thing. He would never let love do to him what it had done to them. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Zoe. "Josh?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could respond. He could let her in. But wasn't that how it always started? A spark, a connection, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. And then, slowly, inevitably, love would decay. Josh exhaled and set the phone down, turning it over so he wouldn't see the screen. He stared at the city beyond his window, the lights flickering in the distance, each one a life, a story, a love that would either last or fall apart. For a moment, he imagined a different version of himself, the one who believed, the one who tried, the one who risked his heart despite knowing the odds. But that wasn't him. Love had a price, and he wasn't willing to pay it. Josh stood, stretched, and turned off his phone. Some people spent their lives chasing love, hoping it would be different for them. Josh? He had already made his choice, and he would spend the rest of his life alone,